by two very significant features of the 20th century as we move towards the middle of the 21st century. So what I'd like to do is begin by talking about capitalism and how I've come to think about capitalism this century. But to do that, you have to go back and say, well, what is capitalism and what is it not? Capitalism is not the ability to control natural resources. That's happened a long time before we thought about the construct of capitalism. The Greeks did it, the Romans did it, and before them, the Egyptians and the Persians did it. So merely controlling natural resources, including animals and people, isn't a unique feature of capitalism. Secondly, capitalism is not a law of nature. Capitalism is not a construct like the laws of physics or chemistry, or even our understanding of biochemistry and life. That capitalism, the end, is a human construct. And capitalism is not the end of history. We're not in some permanent state of being in which we have figured out how to organize our resources the most efficient, sustainable way in perpetuity. So what do I think capitalism's unique characteristic is, and where would I anchor my thinking about the emergence of capitalism on a historical timeline? So the first thing I think is there is a uniqueness about capitalism which relates to its ability to put a value, and we might argue about how accurate that value is, but put a value on time and uncertainty. And the modern origins of that construct arose, in my view, in a very precise papal bull issued by Pope Leo X. And we're now up to Pope Leo XIV. But anyway, Pope Leo X became the first Medici Pope in 1513. And 2 years later, so he didn't waste much time, he issued a papal bull which sought to clarify what was heresy in respect of usury. That usury, which had previously been regarded as the lending of money for return, was redefined by that papal bull because it allowed those who lent money to recover the cost of lending and compensation for the risk they took. That allowance is estimated to have seen the rate of interest in Europe fall from 30% per annum to 10% per annum in the decade that followed. As we were able to put a value on time, the passing of time, and some degree of uncertainty, so we were able to mobilize purchasing power in ways that had been previously left basically to the moneylenders and pawnbrokers. But that isn't enough to simply say, what is modern capitalism? It isn't just simply the observation that interest is charged and the future is discounted. Adam Smith emerged in the Enlightenment as a political economist. He taught politics and economy, and he wrote two great works. One was his theory of natural sentiment, and the other was the more commonly read and understood, The Wealth of Nations. But before he would teach his students The Wealth of Nations, he required that they read and study his theory of moral sentiment. In the heart of that is the proposition that humans are innately empathetic to the situation and circumstances of their fellow being. Based on that assumption, the Wealth of Nations developed a theory of trade and exchange. a theory that we've come to know and understand through the parable of the pin maker, who through specialization was able to create more of the specialized product and trade it with those who had specialized in other products, giving rise to the idea that there was an invisible hand which guided the allocation of scarce resources, so that by acting in our own self-interest, we would lead to the best outcome for everybody collectively. That turned out to be a very powerful proposition, even if we have come to understand it has enormous assumptions and some pretty significant collateral damage. But capitalism began to move ahead with the idea that if a price was put on things that were scarce, that through trade and exchange, everybody could be better off if we each pursued our own self-interest. Now, consumerism is different from capitalism. Consumerism is a manifestation largely that emerged in the 20th century. In a way, one of the founders of consumer society as we know it today was Henry Ford, who had the vision of manufacturing a motor vehicle that could be purchased by one of his workers for the equivalent of 1 year of wage. That construct of the producer who was a consumer, who was able to purchase the output of their own labor, began to take hold as we moved through the 20th century and created, in my view, a consumer society where we have demand inducing supply. Of course, it didn't all happen quickly or the result of a single decision. Following the Great Depression, we reinvented how we thought about central banks and the creation of credit to stimulate demand so that it would bring forth supply. Economists such as John Maynard Keynes managed to explain sufficiently to get politicians to buy into the idea that credit expansion would create demand, induce supply, and create a taxable economy that would enable it to service and repay the debt. Well, we got very good at supply-induced demand. In fact, at the end of the Second World War, there was a great fear that the demobbing of the armies of the Western Alliance would lead to significant social unrest. We forget that at the end of the Second World War, 50% of gross domestic product in the Allied countries was dedicated to the war effort. Of course, the other half was dedicated to subsistence survival. But to take that massive amount of labour and factories and reconvert them into gainful employment was something that led to the explosion of advertising and the application of psychology to create demand that would bring forth supply and thereby create jobs. Another entity that entered the human management system around the late 1950s was the now infamous measure of gross domestic product. Never meant to be a measure of well-being, never meant to encompass all that we as humans value. Gross domestic product was a measure of the subset of things we care about, and it measured only those things that were priced and exchanged in marketplaces. While over the decades subsequently some adjustments have been made, it is still fundamentally a case that GDP is a measure of the taxable busyness in our economy. That GDP itself is of great interest to our elected leaders because it describes and defines the taxable base on which they can operate. But GDP is a weird and wonderful thing. For example, If you don't drive your car, but you walk and take a bike instead, GDP will be lower than it would otherwise be, even if your health is better and your environmental claim on natural resources is lesser. As countries prepare to go to war, GDP, the measure of busyness in the economy, rises. And as they repair the damage done by war, GDP is higher than it might otherwise have been. Bizarre ways of accounting for how we should think about sustainability and prosperity. We also have come to understand that consumerism itself is changing, that in an age of manufacturing, the middle class, the Henry Ford everyman car maker, was able to engage in productive and constructive employment, to be sufficiently well paid, to purchase the goods not only that they produced, but others in their class produced. With high degrees of automation and the new types of technologies which produce marginal goods at virtually no cost, it is far from clear that the consumer will be able to afford the output of capital. How do we then make sure we create the demand that will enable those who need work and income to survive? Many of you have reflected on precisely this challenge as we move forward into the middle of the 21st century. We need to really understand and accept the limits of markets and market exchange as a driver of our society and civilization. But don't assume that the demise of consumerism, that is, demand-induced supply, will itself lead to the demise of capitalism, that is, the process of recognizing the value of time and pricing uncertainty. But indulge me for a minute while I describe, I think, three of the major reasons why we need to be very clear that markets, while they may be efficient in certain constructs, are woefully inadequate in many. The first thing is that markets are myopic. Markets are short-sighted. The discount rate applied to transactions in marketplaces is much higher. In other words, the future is valued much less than we as society would reasonably expect to value finite resources and planetary limits. Market myopia is only one of, but a significant shortfall in a market-based economy. Secondly, markets are reckless. We've designed markets so that basically you can privatize the profits and socialize the costs of monetized activity in our society. Children don't inherit the debts of their parents. Limited liability companies mean that those who invest to take risk do not bear the full consequences of that risk-taking. And the list is quite long when the state intervenes to allow private profits at public cost. And a third major shortcoming is that markets are inherently selfish, something that Adam Smith did not fully explore. The assumption, because of his belief in the empathy of humans, was that the winners would share their winnings from specialization with those who were more vulnerable and less able to support themselves. Some of you may have heard this in the rhetoric of trickle-down economics. The observed reality in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century is that while there are incredible examples of philanthropy in the world today, that the rich and successful attribute their wealth and success to their own hard work and abilities, while assuming that those less fortunate are less deserving. The fundamental tenet of empathy has been challenged by the observation of the 21st century. That in our pursuit of selfish self-interest, We have simply underinvested in collective assets such as public health, public education, collective infrastructure, and we have drawn down heavily on unpriced natural capital to the point where we are pushing planetary limits in ways that are utterly unsustainable. Whether they are the use of our freshwater resources, whether they are the use of our soils and land, whether they are the way in which we discharge pollutants into the oceans and the atmosphere. Some market acolytes would argue that the solution to this problem is simply to put a price on everything. Others would argue that far from polluters paying, those who could pollute should be paid for not polluting. And indeed, our Parliament is about to consider a regulatory takings provision that would essentially allow a property right in those who are polluting that would need to be compensated for if now and in the future that right was being reduced. That has got to be the biggest protection racket anybody could have dreamed of. So coming back to the topic, consumerism and capitalism, I think we are entering a different period in which the ability to stimulate taxable economies through supply made in response to demand, often stimulated by credit, is going to reach some limits. When we see what is in front of the US Congress today, we are certainly testing boundaries, where the creation of massive amounts of new debt on the assumption it will stimulate growth in the taxable economy so that the rat in the wheel can run fast enough to keep ahead is delusional. I think consumerism may be reaching the point where we are unable to sustain that way of creating jobs and employment. The economic rents associated with new technologies such as artificial intelligence and near zero costs of production of marginal output in telecommunications are going to challenge all of societies as to how we put purchasing power in the hands of families who need to feed themselves, clothe themselves, and provide shelter. So, consumerism may fall, but capitalism is likely to persist. I'd be very interested in your views, challenges, and other opinions in a dialogue for the next half hour or so. Kia ora.
Thank you very much for that. I'm just trying to grasp the essence of your comment. I think to see if I've understood it properly. That consumerism has reached a limit because of the inadequacies of the market. Is that part of the hypothesis?
Part of it is that. Part of it is consumers reaching the limits because of the technologies which are now responding to produce goods and services in a way that the producers get all the economic rents and the consumers can't afford to buy them.
Right. Okay. And there's also the assumption, it seems, that demand has to be stimulated.
Yes.
That seems to be a very key concept. Mm-hmm. And if I heard you correctly, you seem to suggest that came about at the end of the war, when the GDP, half of GDP had been devoted to the war effort, and that consumerism had to be stimulated because uh, the war effort obviously was over and something different had to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't it also the case that the whole PR industry and marketing began a couple of decades earlier than that?
Yeah,
When
it
during,
really picked up a pace in the 1950s. I mean, you're right. The psychology and arguments work sort of hanging around in the 30s, but if you look at the sort of Madison Avenue advertising agency boom thing in the 1950s, that was the coming together of theories of psychology and the ability to create demand that would bring forth supply and thereby create jobs and employment. And I guess in the 1950s, what they were absolutely paranoid about was a fall into another Great Depression.
yes, my understanding was that during the Great Depression, when socialism and communism had a bit of a day in the United States, that the government was quite concerned about that, and that part of the development of the marketing and advertising industry was actually supported by the government as a way of focusing citizens' attention on consuming products. So that actually preceded the war effort and then returned to after the war effort.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, elements. You're absolutely right. Elements of the same thing. The Great Depression. How do you get out of a depression? You've got idle plant and equipment, idle hands. How do you stimulate demand so that people will buy things, so that businesses will produce things that will cause people to be employed, and that will give rise to economic activity, which will both give governments some taxable revenue, but also create jobs and employment and distribute income. So yeah, and then of course the greatest way to stimulate demand is to tell everybody that they've got to prepare for war.
yeah. Okay. Thanks for the clarification. I just want to ask our participants now, if you have questions, please use the React icon at the bottom of your screen to raise your hands, as I've tried to do in my video, so you can see, and I'll take your questions in order. While people are figuring out how to do that, the other thing that struck me about your historical review, going back to Leo X, which was an interesting concept, that the idea that the focus was on, you said, I think, time and uncertainty
Mm-hmm.
were critical issues.
Mm-hmm.
When we think of capitalism now and consumerism, what's in mostly in our minds are the whole issue of overconsumption of natural resources, both sources and sinks. There's the planetary boundaries issues, the ecological overshoot, ubiquitous pollution, and so on. And I'm interested in your view of how those play into the limiting factors with respect to consumerism and capitalism and how those two phenomena relate.
Mm. Yeah, and part of it is in game theory the difference between a finite life game and an infinite life game. And if you think time is going to go on forever, and if you think resources are infinite, then you play a very different game than if you think time is limited or resources are finite. And for a long time, it would be fair to say we just assumed that either resources would be available, the ocean was just so big, it would always be there, and whatever we did to it, it would absorb it. Or we assumed a magic technology would turn up just in time. So, when we couldn't get enough horses, we got the motor car. And when the motor car wasn't good enough, we managed to get, other technologies. So this sort of just-in-time technology arrives to lift us to the next plateau. Is a set of circumstances which assumes that you're not going to run out of time, or you're not going to run out of some resource that is irreplaceable and a new technology has not become available. And I think what we're now confronting is some real evidence that um, there are very plausible scenarios in which we do run out of time, and very plausible scenarios in which just in time is just too late for the emergence of a technology that needs to be developed and produced at scale, that there are likely to be irreversible consequences of the circumstances we've already created. I remember I was giving some advice to a group of us. We're working together for the Secretary General of the United Nations, giving advice on greenwashing. It had a much fancier title, but anyway, it's greenwashing. And he had just got back from visiting Pakistan after that, had those massive floods that had displaced 32 million people and put 30% of the country underwater. And he made the observation that while the world then was mesmerized by the extent of the floods, by 2050, the glaciers which feed the rivers of the Indus Valley, which are the water for drinking and agriculture, will be gone. And that's already baked in. That is not going to change. By 2050, those glaciers will be gone. And so, what is the magic technology that is going to turn up just in time to create drinking water and water for agriculture for tens of millions of people who are going to face that certainty within the next 25 years? And the only option for those people is to move. And that's how migrations in the past have occurred as the climate has changed in the past. It's just this is the first time where we've got highly defended arbitrary borders which will prevent people from following the water source.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Okay, let's go to some of the other folks. Kath Wallace, go ahead, Kath.
Okay, thank you. Rod, very interesting and as usual, very concise and well expressed. Just speaking about the sort of analysis that some of us in the environmental economics realm see is the sense that the market can deal with things that people need the funds to be the income to be able to buy it, but secondly, it's got to be what's known as excludable. In other words, people don't get it free if they don't pay for it. And the idea of the market being able to allocate everything is just completely wrong, because if something is not able to be sold in the market, it has to be, if anyone's going to have it, it's got to come by some sort of collective funding and provision or provision. And the other side of non-rivalness is, well, sorry, I'm doing this in the wrong order, but those things that people can get without paying for it are known as non-excludables. And that is also sort of aligned with, or the other sort of part of the analysis is to look at whether things are non-rival. And if you have something that is rival, then a person who consumes it makes it unavailable for someone else. And as we've discovered with whales, if you go and catch them and eat them, they're not available for someone else. But the same whale would be non-rival if you used it in a different way. In other words, you just looked at it. You might have some congestion problems of everyone on the boat, but that's that question of is it rival or not and is it excludable or not will define where markets can function. But the other thing is that there's some people who wrote a really interesting paper quite some time ago, and I've forgotten who they are, but they coined the term of the back of the invisible hand. In other words, the externalities and the lack of public goods, meaning the non-excludable and non-rival things. And I think that sense that markets just technically cannot function if things are non-excludable is a really helpful piece of analysis. And the other thing is, of course, as you've alluded, the issue of distribution and of income and wealth. I think for some reason people have got the idea, people haven't looked at these things, but they've got the ideas that markets should work everywhere and act, and many of the government members seem to have taken that view. I just put that on the table as a interesting way of analysing where markets will and won't work. I'm not saying that markets, when they do work well necessarily, because of those other, the externalities and the failures of various kinds in the market.
Yeah. And I think what's intriguing about the idea of that excludability is if you think about most of the time in the production of output from the natural environment, animals or wheat or grains or whatever, the land once put into ownership and control is able to feature as an excludable kind of proposition. Same with manufacturing, where you've got labor and plant and equipment and you're producing widgets and gadgets. The emerging economics of new technologies, though, is in some ways fundamentally different. But the microeconomics of supply and demand and price determination don't work if your marginal cost of production is zero, which it is if you think about the marginal cost of a Netflix viewing or the marginal cost of AI-generated poetry or whatever. And if it was just interesting but not very common output that was subject to near zero marginal or actually zero marginal cost of production, then it would be quaint and interesting but not that relevant. But we may see in the next 25 years very significant parts of the paid service economy displaced by algorithms that deliver the outcomes that people wanted without the human labor being rewarded to produce them, which is going to create havoc for how you distribute purchasing power, if not through employment.
Indeed, and there was one other thing I meant to mention, which is the converse of something that's non-excludable, which, non-excludable means you can't have it unless you pay for it or in some ways wangle your way in. But the other side, and this is really important for all of us, I think, is what we would call non-rejectable, which may be the fact that your government takes you to war and you don't want to be part of that. Or it may be that, we're suffering climate pollution or pollution of the climate and all these other harms that we and others have generated, and we don't know how to not have it. So.
Okay, Wendy, you have your hand up. You need to unmute yourself and put your question to Dr. Carr.
Okay. Hi. Now, my recent few years' interests have been sort of along the lines of Marilyn. Now I've lost her name. The writer on feminist.
Waring.
Thank you. I couldn't get Waring. Okay. Yep. And also, like, I've been involved for a couple of years, not currently, with the Universal Basic Income groups. So, and that's where you get the idea about people are not going to have money to buy what is getting produced. So you said about Ford and paying his people enough money so they can buy a car. That's been stuck in my head for the last, 3 years. So I guess my question is, do you think the rich people, the people that are scooping up all the money, do you think they understand that we're not going to either want to or be able to buy their stuff? I can't work out. So they run all these protection rackets to protect each other and all their money, and I can't figure how they think it's going to turn out.
Yeah, I don't know how they think. I'm not one of them. But let's just play with a couple of ideas. The first of all, universal basic income. Of course, in New Zealand we already have one. It just happens you have to get to 65 before you can pick it up. So while some people decry it as something we couldn't have, shouldn't have, would never have, the reality is we already have it.
Yes.
And it turns out if you think about it in one way, it looks incredibly expensive because you can think about it as a massive cost that has to be funded by taxation.
Yeah.
The other way you think about it is it puts purchasing power in the hands of people who otherwise wouldn't be able to go buy groceries and pay their rent or pay their mortgages or pay their rates. So
exactly,
whether you think of it as stimulating demand as well as distributing resources and income. Of course, you have to answer the question, well, where are you going to get the revenue from to pay the universal basic income? And of course, that's when the groups who are currently benefiting from the economic rents from the investments and activities they undertake are not as empathetic as Adam Smith would have us believe in his theory of natural sentiment, because they will argue that they are entitled to their profits and earnings on the basis that somehow they were working harder and smarter than the rest of us. And until we figure out how to take economic rents, and that's not the fair return for taking risk and uncertainty or meeting the costs of production. Economic rents accrue in various ways to various entities. Economic rents can be taxed without reducing supply. Economic rents accrue where there are monopoly situations. Economic rents accrue where there are limited access to certain supplies that are necessary to produce certain output. Economic rents accrue where there are limited channels to market. And we sort of focus on the idea that the solution to this is to regulate in a way which eliminates economic rents by creating more competition, relying more heavily on the market. The alternative is to say, all right, well, there are economic rents, just tax them and use that to fund purchasing power elsewhere in the economy.
Doesn't work. I mean, nothing works, does it? Because it's like the people with all the money inhabit a different planet.
Planet B, the one we have yet to discover, yes.
Yeah, it would be good if we got them up to Mars.
Elon Musk is working on that, apparently.
Yeah, but not fast.
Well, this conversation leads to one of the questions that have been put into the chat by Ivan Johnston, and I'll read it. It says, Rod, what is your take on modern monetary theory? Does government debt ever need to be repaid, and why should interest be paid on government debt?
Two different questions. I don't think government debt will ever be repaid. That's the first thing. The second thing is that interest does need to be paid because of this issue of how do you compensate for uncertainty. And the reality is that the future is uncertain and there is a risk that you won't get repaid. And if you're not compensated for that risk, then you may as well consume now or certainly put your money in gold bars and hold them at home. So I do think there is a place for interest. That interest, and I guess the banker in me, of course, would make that argument, so there may be other views. But when the communists endeavoured to run interest-free economies, they ended up with some very poor allocations of scarce resources. There is an interesting scenario which the Egyptians faced of negative interest rates, which led them to build the pyramids, but that's a completely different construct. Let's come back to government debt. If you take on central government debt for the purpose of creating options and choices for future generations who are then going to service, not repay that debt, but will have the benefit of those investments, be it in quality infrastructure, higher levels of public education, better research and development, all of that stuff, then you can make the case for borrowing now to bring forward the ability to procure those valuable investments for the benefit of future citizens. If you're just borrowing money basically to prop up the existing consumption of governments and households, then there will be a day of reckoning in which the servicing of that debt by future generations is not funded from the additional output from better public infrastructure or services. And that's a legacy that we should try and avoid imposing on our children.
Can I raise just a question related to this in terms of the whole concept of an expanding economy and the creation of profit, the role of profit in terms of the capacity of the economy to expand? My understanding is that we have already placed so many demands on the natural world that we risk irreversible tipping points with increasing likelihood of these occurring fairly soon in the next decade or so. And if one regards money as a claim on future resources, then what does that say about the role of profit and growth? I mean, doesn't it suggest we should not be attempting to grow the economy and to create more profit? Because in fact, there are probably already too many claims on resources, and I will either have hyperinflation or deflation. I mean, what do you see as the role of profit in the economy and how it relates to these issues of consumption and our consumerism as a cultural dynamic, as a cultural construct, and the capacity of the planet to actually service those needs?
So I kind of unbundle that question of profit from the question of planetary limits. So let's think about profit. I think of profit as a fair return for delayed consumption and the uncertainty that arises with the passage of time. And I distinguish profit from economic rents. And economic rents go beyond what is necessary to compensate for time and uncertainty and represent essentially a margin over and above that reflects either a scarcity of some critical input or a scarcity of some critical channel to get output into the hands of end users. So I think profit has a useful part to play in some sectors of our society, not all sectors. And I think economic rents are the ones that we should be very clear represent unfair, unjust enrichment due to a set of circumstances which are fortunate for those to whom the economic rents accrue, but are expensive for those who are paying those economic rents. So that's kind of like a profit alone, not the evil. It's these economic rents. Then I think the challenge for unpriced natural capital is not that we should run and put a price on all natural capital. I think the challenge for unpriced natural capital is that the evidence is we are drawing it down at a completely unsustainable rate. And that you are absolutely correct. At some future point in time, when everybody turns up with their tickets to bid at the auction for these scarce resources, they're going to discover they are even more scarce than they thought, which will lead to hyperinflation for the limited amount of those natural resources that remain. And you can see that when, suddenly we discover, surprise, surprise, that the fossil gas field off Taranaki's got less gas in it than the experts thought. And so the price of gas goes up dramatically quickly. Now, that could happen across a whole range of natural capital assets that we have that we take for granted. And the answer isn't to run around slapping a price on all of them. The answer may well be regulatory constraints or prohibitions on the degradation of natural capital. And that's the conversation that I think we have to have, not the one that says, well, if you put a price on it, it'll be rationed. And if it's rationed, it'll be used wisely. There are some things we don't want to use any more of at all.
Yeah, I think many of us would agree with that we are already in a state of ecological overshoot in a very significant way. I mean, the ecological overshoot data suggests that we are drawing down natural capital sources and sinks at a rate almost double that they can regenerate themselves. And this is clearly a terminal condition, and I would think is a more serious dynamic for interfering with consumerism and capitalism than just about anything else. I mean, we are approaching this my understanding from the increasing evidence about accelerating tipping points that we may well reach this, we may cross these tipping points without realizing it and be locked into those situations. And what do you see as policies that can address that? I mean, you talked about regulations and perhaps even banning, or limiting the use of certain resources. Do you see that as a viable way forward?
Well, in democracies, you have to start with education and advocacy, because we will get the elected leaders we vote for. And in other types of social order, there may be different levers you can pull. But for us, in respect of our own national sovereignty, many of these levers are in the hands of our elected representatives, and we will get the elected representatives who we vote for. And we will vote for people on the basis of what we know and understand about what they're proposing, how credible, how realistic, how fair, how deliverable. And essentially they are us. Our elected representatives are a mirror of our society and democracies. Now, fortunately, in New Zealand's case, there's no great evidence of extensive corruption. We are relatively, and I say that carefully, relatively transparent about who gets to influence. There are some unfortunate moves in more recent years where stakeholders with very clearly vested interests in particular outcomes from policy making seem to have a relatively high level of access and influence over our policymakers. But we in New Zealand still live in a world where we can call them out. And if our voting instincts are not to act in a way to denigrate that behaviour by both those with vested interest and those who are the recipients of their influence, then we will live with the consequences of that. So education, advocacy, use of proper political processes, transparency, accountability. The evidence and science alone won't win this debate, because if evidence and science alone was going to win it, we'd have won it by now. It's pretty clear most of the heavy lifting on climate science was done by the 1990s. When the Climate Change Commission was looking at the triggers for a review of our climate targets, the only thing that we found that was really material between 2019 and 2024 was climate scientists had become more concerned about the matters you're raising, more concerned about tipping points, cascading effects, and irreversibility than they had been 5 years before. So that is entirely consistent with your own observation.
Yeah, and we're obviously going in the opposite direction at the moment. Lindsay, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Thank you, Jack. Sorry, my hand-raising symbol's not. Kia ora, Rod. Thank you for an interesting address, and one that took my mind round corners that hadn't been on before. I'm particularly interested in the role of energy, and in particular surplus energy, in this whole equation. I see Nathan put a post up in that regard, but I'm quite convinced by the argument that the proportion of surplus energy available to society has a very big influence on the trajectory that science follows. And we have a lot of variability in that surplus energy, and it's going the wrong way if you're interested in flourishing societies and so on. I'll be very interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, so let me make a couple of. One is that while there are more than 20 countries in the world, including some big ones, that have shown they can decouple that horrible thing, GDP growth as a measure of something. Anyway, they can decouple GDP growth from their emissions profile. In other words, they can reduce greenhouse gas emissions while still growing the measured economy. No country has been able to grow its economy without growing its energy use, which is, to your point, is our version of civilization is both energy hungry and energy intensive. And there is a challenge here in that some of the newest technologies emerging have very significant energy demands associated with them. And while we can expect some productivity gains over the next decade, as those new technologies emerge and deployed, the evidence is that they require more energy per unit of GDP than other uses of energy to date. And the classic one is AI. We're asking a question on AI is largely about energy use and can run, and the numbers some of you may be more familiar with, but can run anything from 50 cents to $2 a question. And that is largely energy use. So the question of where do we get and how do we use and who gets access to clean energy is already a major challenge for the world. We continue to burn fossil fuels in the open air, which is the single most damaging thing that we are doing. And until we stop doing that, everything else is at risk.
Thank you very much.
Nathan, while we're on the energy issue, Nathan, I know you have a few things to say as well as perhaps ask some questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jack, and hello, Rod. Two questions in the chat, which relate to the first is the animated GIF which I've shared, and I don't know. Can I just share my screen? Oh, I can. It's actually
share this. Okay.
no, there we go.
Sharing.
Right. So, can you see that, Rod, and everybody else?
Yeah. Okay.
So what this shows is over time, the size of the energy inputs to the economy growing, and as a percentage, normalized to 100% of GDP, the relative investment in economic activity to sustain those energy flows increases, which squeezes as a percentage of total energy our consumption spending down, because there's a necessary component to that. The thing that we see get majorly squeezed is discretionary spending, and that's
we're not actually seeing that on the screen. We're seeing a whole lot of other things. At least I am.
Are you?
Yeah, just a whole lot of
okay.
lists of things and this and that. The link you put in the chat worked.
Yeah.
This
okay. I'm sorry. I don't. Well,
anyway, keep
okay.
Keep
so sorry. That's the first thing. The second thing is. So I think that's the dynamic that we're seeing. We have essential spending which we are trying to sustain. We have a lot of discretionary spending that's dropped off, and just prior to COVID, there was a major financial crisis brewing, mass drop in everything, and then the second point and the second chart is that as we deplete a resource like oil, which is, I mean, oil specifically is, the master resource of industrial society. That what happens is the energy net of the production of that oil changes exponentially over time. And so whilst the total amount of economically extractable resource as defined by a sort of economic projections would suggest that there's 2 trillion barrels or whatever the number is of total extract resource, the actual amount that can be extracted becomes an energetic zero-sum game that is significantly less than that, somewhere very close to where we are now. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on whether you've come across. Do you have any on them?
Yeah, so a couple of interesting data points to share, and some of you may know this as well, but the proven reserves of coal on the balance sheets of listed public entities equals 150 years at the current consumption rate. And the proven reserves of liquid fossil fuel, in other words, petroleum, and fossil gas are about 50 years each in terms of the reserve. There is no way we can burn
at current rates of consumption.
Yes, current rates of consumption. There is no way we can burn all of that stuff in the open air and still live on a planet that we would recognize in the timeframes that matter for us to adapt to the changing world. So
I don't disagree that those are the economic projections. What I'm coming at this from is more of a sort of biophysical economics analysis, which is a different point really to that response.
But here's the interesting thing about the end game for the holders of those reserves, and I don't know how this will play out. If you own some of those reserves and you think that the limit is sooner, either by regulation, social license, or technological limits, your point, then you've got a choice to make. Do you dig and pump as much as you can, as soon as you can, before the game is over? Or do you try and hold back your reserves in the expectation that the end price before the game finishes will be higher and you can extract more economic rents? And either of those is a plausible equilibrium in the end game. But I don't know which way that will go. Now, part of me actually wants the price of fossil fuels to go through the roof, because that will provide the rewards and incentives for technologies that don't rely on the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air. But if you're the Saudis and your cost of producing a barrel of oil is $10 at the wellhead, and you think you're going to leave hundreds of millions of barrels in reserve in the dirt because new technologies are going to take it out for you, you might want to pump that stuff sooner at a lower price. And that's a real risk to the development of clean tech. So I'm interested in how you think that's going to play out in the end game.
Well, I think what's actually happening is the Saudis have, subsidized largely the internal country consumption of oil, to the point where as their fields are now starting to deplete and the economics are shifting somewhat, and that $10 a barrel figure, I'm not sure whether that's still accurate or not. It would seem like they have to pump, because if they don't export at the rates at which they are accustomed to, then they don't have the cash flows that support the governmental and societal expenditure that they've committed to. And so they're trapped. They're not really able. It's not really optional for them to shift their product significantly in the way you're suggesting. From a game theoretical point, they might like to.
Yeah, I think the question you raise is a fair one. What they need is a revenue stream of price times quantity. The question is to what, if any extent, they can choose price or quantity. Exactly. Given they need the optimal revenue.
But that again, that's an economic question, and again, that's sort of more of a, I guess you'd say, classical economics sort of question, rather than the biophysical point that I'm trying to make, which is actually based in physics. It's not something that there's a technological solution to in the way that you suggested I was saying, because it's not simply a case of, if we've got better technology, then we can pump the oil. We've got the technology to pump this oil. The question is, in terms of the energy net of the cost of production, at what point do we see this drop off? And I think that a lot of the things that are going on at the moment in the global sense can be linked back to the fact that, despite the number fudging and papering over the cracks that government statisticians are doing to support, this narrative that GDP is on the rise and all the rest of it. I don't think that is the truth of the matter when you look at the underlying fundamental. I mean, just the productivity of debt. You mentioned before. The additional debt that people are having to take on to create $1 of GDP in all advanced economies is skyrocketing, and you have to ask, why is that the question? And the declining energy narrative very clearly demonstrate would show a correlation with that trend that we're observing, and I think is a reasonable explanation for what's actually going on. So then you start to ask the question, well, how go on for? And I think my personal feeling is the answer to that a lot less time than the numbers you stated, 150 years of coal and 50 years of oil and gas would suggest, because that's based on the proven economic to extract reserves, which I don't believe are an accurate reflection of what we'll actually be able to get to the ground. And the economists go, "Oh, we're surprised," in the same way that they are doing currently with the New Zealand gas fields, which is a great example. I mean, of exactly that. It's like, "Oh, we didn't realize it was going to happen." It's like, yeah, it's because you're looking at it from an economic lens and not using physics as your basis for understanding of this physical trend that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
I'm tagging in on this story. I don't know the answer. I certainly don't believe we are going to burn 150 years of coal and 50 years of oil and gas. However, it's not going to end with that stuff being burnt.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if we do get an energetic collapse, then, for example, in Southland, where I'm based, I could see in 100 years from now us having an economy based around burning wood and lignite. Actually, it's quite possible we will continue at some smaller scale with, limited flow energies. Obviously, there wouldn't be the other industrial outputs to support the sort of scales that we're talking about, or crazy things like coal to liquids, hopefully. But yeah.
Pretty good.
Yeah. Rod, more questions from here. If I understand what you're saying about, accepting the fact that we have biophysical limits, that we have already exceeded some that are creating existential threats for us, and that we have increased complexity in our economic and social and political systems. And complexity is an issue that hasn't come up yet, but I'd be interested in your take on it, especially again with what I mentioned at the opening, your background in risk management, because risk management is largely about uncertainty, isn't it? And it seems to me that the uncertainties that we're facing are rapidly multiplying, and that our capacity to deal with this complexity is likely to be a more serious and approaching limit to how the existing system is working. I mean, I guess I'm trying to formulate the question in terms of, do you see the current economic system as something that can be adjusted and fixed, or do you see it that we really need to make some very radical changes in order to ensure that we don't breach these biophysical limits to the point where they're irreversible, which we don't seem to have quite got to yet, but are approaching rapidly? You talk about education and advocacy and so on. And yes, those are traditionally the ways of getting political change. But it seems to me that the complexity that we face and the rapidity with which we're approaching these limits has put us in a very different and difficult situation, and that we need some different kinds of thinking if we are to deal with this predicament. I don't even think it's a problem, it's a predicament.
Yeah.
There may not be any solutions. I'm curious as to what your thoughts about whether you see solutions, or do we somehow adjust to a predicament that has consequences?
So I like to think of myself as an optimist. I think hope is an important part of what drives constructive human behavior. I think that we need all of the tools that we've managed to accumulate in our toolbox, including understanding of markets and their limits, including understand regulation and unintended consequences, including understanding the impacts of collective action, including understanding the fallacy of composition and externalities and all of those things. I mean, there's no single silver bullet here. That I do think you're right to identify the sort of polycrisis, as they say, that the coming together of a whole bunch of uncertainties creates interaction effects which make it even harder to try and, without even forecasting, even understand what's happening next week, next month, next year. And history is full of sets of circumstances where societies confronted with massive degrees of uncertainty, complexity, conflict and confusion do degenerate into autocratic states. That one of the challenges is, do democracies survive poverty? And that may be a very challenging conversation, but capitalism takes many forms. The state capitalism in China, people's capitalism in social Soviet Germany, our form of consumer capitalism. So these systems change and evolve, and at any one time on the planet, there are a number of different ways of organizing society to deal with complex and uncertain events. I think if we want our democratic system to prevail, then we have to be ruthless about our demand that things are transparent, that we abhor corruption, that we support our elected leaders, but only so long as they operate in ways which are constitutionally appropriate, and that we don't have unreasonable and unrealistic expectations that encourage elected leaders to make promises we know they cannot deliver on. And there are a number of those who vote for things that they wish were true in the absence of any evidence that they are true.
Yeah, let me put a question a little bit differently. We often talk about what's politically feasible. I mean, all of the things that you've identified clearly would be helpful if they were implemented. But there are obstacles to many of those things. If we change the conversation a bit and focus not on what is politically feasible, but what is biophysically necessary in order to avoid, or at least minimize, the impact of the biophysical changes that we're seeing. What kinds of policies and education around these issues would you see as being highly relevant? And with respect to the question, are you familiar with the work being done at the University of Exeter, the concept of planetary solvency? I'll send it to you because I think you'd be intrigued by it, given your background in risk management. This group of Earth scientists have teamed up with the actuaries, the Actuarial Society in the UK, and they've obviously used the best Earth science available, but they've applied actuarial methodologies to assessing the polycrisis that you mentioned. You know, looking not only at climate, but also at other ecological destruction, pollution, but also the social aspects in terms of conflict and polarization and so on. And it's a very interesting kind of analysis, and suggests one of their conclusions is that we are currently, when I say we, I mean the global institutional reactions to climate and biodiversity loss, is that we are collectively grossly underestimating the risks. And that by accepting that we have much higher risks, we need much more radical change.
Interesting. Yeah.
But the extent to which this is being integrated into government thinking, I think is we're a long way from there yet. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are about putting aside what's feasible politically. What do your understanding is what's absolutely necessary for us to aim for?
Well, the first thing is that we better get used to the idea we have to adapt to a climate changed world. The fact is we have baked in, and if you look at the trajectories, you have to be realistic about what's going to happen during this century. So whether it's New Zealand as a sovereign state, whether it's Canterbury or Auckland as a region, whether it's your business or your household, you really do now need to think about what is the impact of the changing climate going to be on the resources that you use, your ability to access those resources, the price at which they're likely to be available, the consumers who are likely to want to buy and afford to buy the goods that you produce, because all of that stuff is going to happen to you whether you voted for climate change or not. That's one of the physical realities of the world that we have created and seem to find very challenging to step back from. The second thing is the energy transition. Look, there's no silver bullet, but New Zealand has choices that some other countries don't have. And they all involve trade-offs, including let's use the energy that we have available as wisely as we can, with as little waste as possible, with the smallest environmental impact we can have. So efficiency and waste minimization have got to be a top priority rather than just looking for ever more of stuff to waste. The energy transition for New Zealand, we don't have the world's best solar, but the solar we have is good enough. In fact, given that we used 45 terawatt hours of electricity last year, you could put 50,000 hectares of New Zealand under solar panels with today's technology, and subject only to the challenge of battery and intermittency, you generate 50 terawatt hours of power. So, you don't need to invent many new technologies to be able to stop combusting fossil fuels for the generation of electricity in New Zealand. We do need to figure out the storage issue. Transport, we have got to get wise on transport. Privately owned and operated heavy vehicles combusting fossil fuels in the open air when there are known, available and affordable alternative technologies that do less damage, not only to the planet, but to local communities. We've got to stop the argument the rich should be allowed to pay and the poor should just literally suck it up. I think there's a very strong case for regulated tailpipe emission standards for the already in-country fleet that make it very clear these things are going to be taken off the roads before the end of their technical lives. When it comes to the built environment, we do need to swallow some dead rats and make sure our public transport infrastructure is available, affordable, reliable along densely populated road corridors. And the social license to do that is very challenging for neighbourhoods which happen to find themselves on public transport corridors. So, land use is going to change anyway, whether we like it or not. The climate is going to impact what can be grown, what animals can be reared across different domains in New Zealand. The dairy farming in Northland is going to be in trouble if it's not already. sheep farming in the high country is going to be in trouble. And so some of these adjustments to small rural communities are going to happen whether you vote for whoever you vote for or not. And we can either think we can vote for somebody who will make it stop, or we have to get real about how do we deal with the fact that not all losses and costs can be compensated for.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Beverly, you've had your hand up for a while. Go ahead.
It's not me, actually, Jack. I'm noticing that Dougal and Wendy Killing have had questions in the chat for a little while.
Okay, Dougal, would you like to put your question directly to Dr. Carr? Are you still there, Dougal? Well, I'll see if I can find his question. Here it is. I'll read Dougal's question, and if he wants to add anything to it, he's welcome to. It says, so Rod, do you think the best way forward is for government to focus on excellent public services so essential needs are met without the need to consume and use limited remaining resources? If so, it appears this government's doing the opposite. Well, that's clear, yes. But anyway, I guess the focus of the question is should government focus on excellent public services?
Yeah, I'm here, Jack.
G'day, Dougal.
There you are. Go ahead, Dougal. Clarify.
Yeah. You put the question. I guess just the background is that for a long time I thought, okay, we're in trouble with resources, but how does a government move to reduce consumption, reduce throughput without total collapse, that's politically just unacceptable. And it just seemed to me this idea of pouring money into really good public resources, so there's not that demand coming through for consumption, people's education, their medical, their transport, etc. needs are all basically there. And it just seemed to me that that's the opportunity for us politically to go there. So I'd really like to hear whether Rod thinks that's the way to go. And of course, I believe that now and horrified to see what the government's doing. So, yeah.
So look, there isn't really a silver bullet, but I will be, at your end of this debate, because I do think that if you invest in public health, you get good outcomes for families and children in the next generation and very low likelihood of regret. If you do invest in public education, so it's relevant, timely, of a high quality and engaging for students, you are building an asset which is more likely to be resilient to uncertainty and unknowable future states, less likely to be polarized by slogans and lack of evidence. So it won't surprise anybody on this call to know I'd be a strong supporter of investing in public health and public education. The built environment, I definitely think investing in shared transport opportunities so that we can make affordable, reliable, accessible transport available to reduce the inconvenience of relying on public transport, while in time increasing the cost of privately owned and operated personal modes of transport. But if you do that without a proper transition, what you discover is it's the vulnerable people in remote communities who bear the brunt because there aren't available, affordable public transport options for them. So you have to be kind of thoughtful about that as well. But yes, we know that markets will underinvest in collective assets such as education, public health, and public infrastructure.
Okay, Lindsay, you've got your hand up again. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Dougal, did you want to add something to that before?
No, I just wanted to thank him. That's all. Yeah,
go ahead, Lindsay.
Yeah. Jack, it's a follow-up energy question, Rod. There's a lot of serious research around that suggests that we're kidding ourselves if we think we're going to extract minerals at the rate that we need to sustain a global energy transition. I think one of the leaders of that is Simon Michaud in Finland, but he's not the only one. I mean, his figures suggest that there isn't enough to do the first iteration of a renewable global energy supply, let alone keep reinstating it over time. Have you encountered this, or have you got any comments?
Yeah, look,
on that?
there are quite a lot of those who extrapolate current technologies, and there are quite a lot who just invent magic new technologies to try and square the circle. And I'm not a good enough student in this to form an independent view. What I do know is we have to do less of what we're currently doing as soon as we can by as much as possible. And that if there isn't a perfect pathway to the future, at least a pathway that involves less combustion of fossil fuels in the open air anywhere at any time will be a better outcome. Now, whether lithium-ion batteries are going to be the battery of the future, I highly doubt. Whether lead-acid batteries are going to be the stationary energy storage option of the future, I don't know. Whether we're going to get massive improvements in our efficient use of the energy that we do use, I don't know. I mean, nobody saw the massive energy savings from moving from incandescent light bulbs to LED light bulbs. That the real problem is, in some cases, we're spinning up new demand for energy faster than we are decarbonizing the existing production of electricity. And we may therefore end up with, half the energy's renewable, but we've got twice as much combustion as well, because the demand for energy has continued to grow exponentially, even if we're more efficient in producing and using it, even if energy intensity of emissions has declined, total emissions may not decline by as much as they have to. But none of that's a reason to delay doing what we can by as much as we can, as soon as we can.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to just follow up with on some of the question that Dougal had asked, and as well related to the energy issues. It seems to many of us that the overconsumption that we've been doing globally is putting us at an existential risk. And that, as Dougal suggests, that we need a considerable reduction in the amount of material throughput in the economy to basically take our foot off Mother Nature's neck. Obviously, that would be very disruptive to the kind of lifestyle that Western societies have become accustomed to. But if there were universal basic services, not just universal basic income, but basic services including education, healthcare, dental, housing, and so on, do you think that would provide people with the kind of security they would need to be able to adapt to the kind of disruption that a significant reduction in economic throughput would accompany?
My concern with that is I don't think there's a smooth transition to that state. I think you may rebuild society after a collapse in the way that you've described it, out of necessity. But I don't see the signs that the middle class are prepared to adopt at pace and scale the kind of reform that they would have to take up when confronted with a catastrophe. So I've just been intrigued even the last week. So the heat domes that are forming over the North America and Europe, almost all of the news reports link it to climate change. And yet when we look at the news coverage of the recent inundations in New Zealand, they're called weather events. We're not joining the dots. We're assuming that bigger drains is all that's required, or bigger stock banks, or more dredging at the river mouths. I mean, as a society, we have managed to delude ourselves that these losses are the consequence of inadequate action by others. The inadequate action being either local or central government hasn't ... warned me soon enough, cleaned up before the event, learnt from past mistakes. And until we wise up to the fact that these severe, frequent weather events are normal and are the consequence of the change in climate and will increase in severity and frequency, and not all losses will be compensated for, might people begin to think that a universally available and supported education system, health system, and benefit system is valuable because there, but for the grace of God, go me and mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And again, if people with your mana can be making these comments publicly, it would go a long way, I think, in helping people realize that any transition is not going to be smooth, and to give up that idea and to embrace the disruption collectively and support each other in the process is probably my view, the best we can anticipate.
Yeah, we are going to end up in a permanent state of recovery.
Yes.
And it's going to be a challenge, because at the moment we think of recovery as a finite project that has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
No, it's the new normal.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, this has been a very interesting discussion, as no surprise, given your background and scope. So thank you very much for taking the time and effort to speak with us. And we'll be putting this recording up on our website and our other groups. And I'm seeing some hand claps up there with the reactions. I think we very much appreciate what you've done, and not only this evening, but in your role as commissioner, and wish you were still there. So, although I'm sure you're relieved to be out of the hot seat.
Oh, I'm doing some much more fun things. We have a family business providing solar as a service to schools, NGOs, and not-for-profits. So that's kind of fun. And I just got appointed as a trustee of the Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust. So I'm going to learn more about pests than I ever thought I needed to know. Anyway.
Excellent. Well, good wishes to you, and great success.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. And thanks to all the participants. And
could I just ask, Rod, what's the name of that company providing the solar as a service?
Solar as a service. It's my son-in-law's company, so it's Connor Operating Group, or COG, COG-NZ. Awesome. Has a little website. So our latest one to go live was Rangiora High School with a 120 megawatt array. It's kind of good fun.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Very good. All good wishes.
Oh, indeed. Thanks, everybody.
Well. Night.
Bye.